My name is Lena Voss. I'm 35. And 3 months ago, I found out that a trust fund exists. A trust my late grandfather set up in my name when I was 7 years old, that was supposed to reach me at 35. That birthday came and went in January. Quietly. No attorney called. No letter arrived. No deposit appeared in any account I own. Nothing. Just January, turning into February, turning into March, and then a conversation, an accidental one, with my grandfather's former bookkeeper at a family gathering I almost didn't attend, that changed everything I thought I knew about the last 28 years of my life. The trust was real. It had been real since I was 7. But by the time I was old enough to receive it, most of what it had contained was gone. Not spent by the markets. Not lost to fees. Gone in the specific quiet way that money disappears when someone who has access to it decides, year by year, that their need is greater than the person the money was meant for. My parents had been drawing from it. For years. Under a clause in the trust document that gave them limited access during my minority, that was meant to cover specific educational and medical expenses on my behalf, and that they had used, instead, for things I was never told about and that had nothing to do with me. Before I tell you what the bookkeeper told me, and what I found when I started looking, please take a moment to like and subscribe. Only if this story is landing somewhere real. Drop your location and local time in the comments. I read every single one. Now, let me take you back. I want to start with my grandfather. Because without him, none of this exists, and because understanding who he was is the only way to understand why what happened was such a specific and particular kind of wrong. His name was Leonard Voss. He was 81 when he died. And he had been, for the 60 years preceding his death, a man who understood money the way very few people actually do. Not as something to display. Not as something to accumulate for its own sake. But as something to structure, carefully, around the people and the things you cared most about, so that the caring outlasted you. He had built a small regional manufacturing company from a single machine shop in 1962. By the time he retired, 32 years later, it had grown into something that employed 400 people and that he sold, carefully, deliberately, to a buyer who committed to maintaining the workforce rather than to the one who offered more money but had a history of gutting the operations he acquired. He left money on the table to protect his employees. That is who Leonard Voss was. He married my grandmother Ruth in 1961. They had 2 children. My father, David, and my Aunt Caroline, who lives in Oregon now and with whom I have a warm, if geographically distant, relationship. My grandmother died in 2004, 3 years before Leonard, and her death produced in him the specific kind of recalibration that some people undergo in grief, a sharpening of priorities, a clearer assessment of what mattered and what he wanted to do with the time he had remaining. One of the things he did, in the years after Ruth died, was establish trusts. Not a single family trust. Individual trusts, for each of his grandchildren, structured with the specific precision of a man who had spent decades managing legal and financial instruments and who understood, with hard-won clarity, the difference between a document that does what you intend and a document that merely appears to do what you intend. He had an estate attorney. A good one. A woman named Patricia Wells who had worked with him for 15 years and who, according to what I eventually learned, had pushed back on certain aspects of the trust structure and had been overruled by Leonard in specific ways that she had documented in her files. The trust in my name was established in 2003, the year I turned 7. I know this because I eventually obtained the documents. The trust was funded initially with $340,000. It was structured to grow through a conservatively managed investment portfolio, and it was designed to be distributed to me in full when I reached the age of 35, which was January of this year. Leonard did not tell my parents how much the trust contained. He told them it existed, and he told them the terms, and he appointed my father as the trust's trustee during my minority, which is the decision that Patricia Wells had pushed back on, and which Leonard had overruled, because he trusted his son and because he could not imagine, when he made that decision, that the trust he had built for me would be the thing his son spent the next several years quietly dismantling. The clause. I need to explain the clause, because the clause is the mechanism, and understanding it is essential to understanding how something this significant could have happened across a period of years without being visible. The trust document included a provision, standard in many minors' trusts, that allowed the trustee, meaning my father, to draw from the trust principal or earnings during my minority for the purpose of covering specific categories of expenses on my behalf. Educational expenses, medical expenses, and a third category that Patricia Wells had apparently objected to and that Leonard had insisted on, which was described in the document as extraordinary circumstances related to the beneficiary's welfare. That third category was the one that functioned, in my father's administration of the trust, as an open door through which money moved in ways that Leonard had never intended and that I never knew were happening. My father drew from the trust 17 times between 2003 and 2018, which is the year I turned 22 and became legally an adult, fully capable of managing my own affairs. 17 withdrawals, ranging in size from $8,000 to $63,000. Totaling, across those 15 years, $281,000. When the trust was finally distributed to me, it should have contained the original $340,000 plus 15 years of compound growth at a conservative rate. It contained $47,000. $47,000, from what should have been well over $500,000, by any reasonable projection of the original principal's growth across 15 years of managed investment. $47,000. And I almost received it without knowing any of the rest. Let me tell you about the family gathering. It was a cousin's birthday, held at my Aunt Caroline's house when she was visiting from Oregon. A casual afternoon, late spring, the kind of gathering where food is on a long table, and children are running in the backyard, and adults drift between small conversations in the kitchen and on the porch. I was in the kitchen, refilling my drink, when a woman I didn't immediately recognize came to stand beside me at the counter. She introduced herself as Margaret Holt. She said she had worked for my grandfather for many years, as his personal bookkeeper, and she had known me as a small child and wanted to say hello. I said hello. I said I was glad to see her. I asked about her life since my grandfather died. She asked about mine. Standard pleasant gathering conversation, and then she said, almost in passing, almost as though she assumed I already knew, that she was glad I had finally reached the age to receive Leonard's trust. She said she had always hoped I would do something meaningful with it, the way he had intended. She said she remembered when he set it up. She said it was such a careful, deliberate thing he did for each of his grandchildren. Making sure the money was there when they were old enough to use it well. I said, I turned 35 in January. She said, yes. She smiled. So the distribution would have come through around then. I said, I haven't received anything. Her face did something very specific then. Something that was not quite alarm but was adjacent to it. The specific face of someone who has just said something they have realized, a half-second too late, may have disclosed more than they intended. She said, oh. She said it quietly. She said, I may have misremembered the timing. She smiled again, more carefully this time. She excused herself and moved toward the other end of the kitchen. I stood at the counter for a few minutes, holding my drink, not moving. I thought about the trust. I thought about January. I thought about the fact that no letter had arrived, no attorney had called, no deposit had appeared. I thought about the face Margaret Holt had made when I told her I hadn't received anything. And I thought, with the specific clarity of someone who works in financial compliance, which is my actual profession, that the face she had made was not the face of a person who had misremembered something. It was the face of a person who suddenly understood that something had gone significantly wrong. Work in financial compliance. I have spent 11 years identifying irregularities in financial accounts. I know what the face of a discovered discrepancy looks like. I had just seen it on a bookkeeper who had worked for my grandfather for many years. And I had just told her that I had received nothing from a trust she believed existed and that I had just reached the age to receive. I left the party early. I told my cousin I had a headache, which was true in the sense that the specific pressure behind my eyes that I get when something large and complicated is beginning to assemble itself in my mind is technically a headache. I drove home. I sat at my desk. And I started making calls. The first call was to Patricia Wells, my grandfather's estate attorney. She had retired 3 years earlier, but her former firm still had her contact information, and a message I left on a Tuesday afternoon was returned by Wednesday morning, which told me something about Patricia Wells before we had spoken a single word. She returned calls quickly. Even retired ones, she said. "Lena, I have been wondering when you might call." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because your grandfather's trust was structured to distribute to you at 35, and I had a note in my file to follow up if I had not heard from you by February." I said, "It's April." She said, "I know." I was trying to decide what to do about that. I said, "Please tell me what you know." She told me. Not everything, because she was careful and professional and there were things she could not tell me without the trust documents, which she said I had every right to request from the current trustee, meaning my father, and which I had every right to obtain through legal channels if he declined to provide them. But she told me the structure. She told me about the clause. She told me that she had objected, specifically and on the record, to naming my father as trustee with access to the principal during my minority, and that Leonard had overruled her. She said, "I want to be clear that I do not know what happened with the trust after it left my direct involvement. I drafted it. I have not administered it. What I can tell you is that the structure I designed had specific safeguards that were subsequently modified at your grandfather's direction, and that the modifications were the ones I had the most concern about." Asked my father for the trust documents on a Thursday evening. I called him. I did not text him because I wanted to hear his voice when I asked. He answered warmly. We talked briefly about ordinary things. And then I said, "Dad, I need to ask you about grandfather's trust. I need the full accounting of the trust from 2003 to the present." He was quiet for a moment. A specific kind of quiet. Then he said, "The distribution was smaller than we expected because of market conditions." I said, "What were the market conditions?" He said, "There were years when the investments underperformed." I said, "Dad, I work in financial compliance. I would like to see the full accounting. The withdrawals, the investment statements, everything." He was quiet again. Longer this time. Then he said, "I'll have my attorney pull the records together." I said, "How long will that take?" He said, "A few weeks." I said, "I'll give you 10 days, the records arrived in 8. I think the 8-day timeline tells you something about the conversation my father had with his attorney after our phone call, and about what his attorney told him about the specific position he was in if he declined to produce records he was legally required to maintain. I read them over the course of a weekend. A full weekend, Saturday morning through Sunday evening, with breaks only for meals and the specific physical need to stand up and walk around when you have been reading documents for 6 hours and your back has made its position on the matter clear. I had a legal pad. I had highlighters. I had the specific focused attention that comes from doing something professionally for 11 years and then encountering the most personal version of the work you have ever been asked to do. The withdrawals were documented. All 17 of them, with the stated purpose recorded in my father's handwriting in the trust's administrative records, as the document structure required. The stated purposes were the thing that made the weekend hardest. Because my father was not a careless administrator. He had written something in the purpose field for every single withdrawal. He had not left it blank. He had not written personal use or other. He had written things that sounded, in isolation, like they fit within the clause's language. Emergency home repair related to beneficiary welfare. Family stability expense supporting beneficiary's household. Educational supplemental support. Medical emergency, family unit, none of them were for me. I knew, specifically and clearly, that not one of those 17 withdrawals had produced anything in my life that could be traced to a benefit I had received. I had paid my own tuition. I had paid my own medical expenses. I had moved out at 22 with the specific understanding that my financial life was mine to manage, because that was the household culture my parents had established, the culture of independence and self-sufficiency that I had internalized completely without ever knowing that a trust fund existed with my name on it. Without ever knowing that the self-sufficiency I was practicing was, in part, self-sufficiency produced by my parents' use of money that was supposed to be mine. Want to tell you about the conversation I had with my father in person, in his kitchen, on a Saturday 3 weeks after receiving the documents. Because it was the hardest conversation I have ever had, and because the specific content of what he said matters to understanding what has happened since I drove to my parents' house. My mother was home. I asked if we could talk without her present, not because I planned to exclude her permanently but because I needed the first conversation to be between my father and me, and because some conversations need a specific configuration to be honest rather than managed. My mother said she understood and went to the garden. My father and I sat at the kitchen table. I put the legal pad on the table. I said, "I've gone through the trust records." He said, "I know." I said, "I want you to tell me, in your own words, what happened. Not what was written in the purpose field. What actually happened." He looked at the legal pad for a long time. He looked at his hands. Then he said, "We had very hard years with Lena. You were young, and you didn't see all of it. The business had difficulties. There were periods when the household was not stable in the way it appeared from the outside. I thought, and I believed this genuinely, that the clause covered situations where the family's stability was at risk, because the family's stability was also your welfare." I said, "The clause covered my welfare. Not the family's." He said, "I believed they were the same." I said, "Did you believe that the first time? Or did you believe it by the third time?" He didn't answer. I said, 17 times, Dad. Over 15 years. $281,000. He was quiet. Then he said, "I knew it was wrong. By the second year I knew it was wrong. And I couldn't find a way to stop that didn't require me to tell someone what I had started." I said, "You could have told me." He said, "You were a child." I said, "I wasn't a child at 22 when you stopped drawing from it. I wasn't a child at 25 or 30. He said, "By then there was too much to explain, and I didn't know how to explain it." I said, "You found a way to not explain it for 13 more years." He said, "Yes." He said it quietly. without any qualifier attached to it. Just yes, I said, I need you to understand the specific thing that this cost me, not in dollar terms but in the terms of my own life. I did not go to graduate school because I believed I could not afford it. I could not afford it because the money that was supposed to be mine was not there. I made a specific decision about a specific opportunity based on a specific financial reality that was a fiction created by your use of money that was designated to me. He looked at me. He said, I know. I said, I'm not saying that for sympathy. I'm saying it because I need you to hold the specific weight of it rather than the general weight of something having gone wrong. He said, I understand the specific weight of it. I have understood it for years. That has not made it easier to say out loud. I asked him what he intended to do. He said, I would like to repay what was taken. I said, the $47,000 that was distributed to me was not a full distribution. It was what remained after 17 withdrawals. He said, I know. I said, with the compound growth the trust should have generated across 15 years, a reasonable projection puts the shortfall between $300,000 and $400,000. He said, I know. I said, do you have that? He said, no. Not immediately. He said, I have a house with equity. I have a retirement account. I have assets that are not immediately liquid. I said, I would like to work with an attorney to establish a repayment structure. Not as a punishment. As a resolution. He said, yes. I said, and I need this to be told to Aunt Caroline. He was quiet. I said, she has grandchildren. Grandfather may have set up trusts for them too. She deserves to know what happened with mine so she can check on theirs. He said, that will be a difficult call. I said, yes, it will. He made the call to Aunt Caroline that same evening. She called me the following day. She had checked her children's trusts, and they were intact, which I was genuinely relieved to hear, and she was the specific kind of angry that comes from someone who loves two people, one of whom has harmed the other, and who cannot fully reconcile those two loves with the single clear fact in front of her. She said, Lena, I'm so sorry. I said, it's not yours to apologize for. She said, he's my brother. I said, yes. She said, what are you going to do? I said, I'm going to pursue a repayment structure, and I'm going to let the legal process determine the terms. She said, are you going to pursue anything criminal? I said, I've consulted with my attorney. The legal landscape around trustee misconduct is specific, and the civil remedies are more direct and more likely to produce the outcome I'm actually seeking, which is repayment rather than punishment. She said, and the relationship? I said, Aunt Caroline, I love my father. I have not stopped loving him while I have been doing all of this. The two things are coexisting in me right now, and I cannot tell you yet what that coexistence produces in the long term. I need time to find out. The repayment structure is being formalized now. My attorney and my father's attorney have been in conversation for 6 weeks. The structure will likely involve the sale of specific assets and a payment plan for the remainder, extending over several years, which is not what I would have chosen if I were choosing from a position of unlimited options, but which reflects the actual financial reality of what my father has available to repay. The legal term for what he did, trustee breach of fiduciary duty, carries civil liability, and the documentation supports the claim. My attorney has been clear about the strength of the position. I have been clear about what I actually want, which is the money, and the acknowledgement, and the ongoing relationship with my father on terms that are honest rather than terms that require me to pretend this did not happen. Why Mother called me 2 weeks after the kitchen conversation. She said, Lena, I need to tell you that I didn't know. I said, about the trust? She said, I knew the trust existed. I didn't know about the withdrawals. Not all of them. Some of them I suspected. None of them I fully understood until after your conversation with your father. She said, I want you to know that I am not defending him. What he did was wrong, and I told him that, directly, when he told me the full picture. I said, I believe you, Mom. She said, I also want you to know that the years he described, the hard years, they were real. It doesn't justify what he did. But I don't want you to hear the story as if there was no difficulty. There was real difficulty. I said, I understand that real difficulty existed. I also understand that the response to real difficulty was to use money designated to his daughter rather than to tell his daughter the difficulty existed. She said, yes. That's exactly right. She said it the way people say things they have been saying internally for a long time and are finally allowed to say out loud. I said, how are you doing with all of this? She said, I'm managing. She said it the way she always says it, with the specific compressed competence that I recognize as the family's default emotional register and that, this time, I found not frustrating but, strangely, comforting. She was managing. That was real too. I want to talk to you directly now, wherever you are, whatever time it is. Found out about a trust fund that was meant for me because of a chance conversation at a birthday party with a woman who assumed I already knew it existed. If Margaret Holt had been on the other side of the room. If I had not been standing at the counter at that exact moment. If she had not said what she said in the offhand way she said it, assuming it was already known. I would have lived the rest of my life not knowing. My father would have lived the rest of his life not being asked. And $47,000 would have arrived in January, and I would have been grateful for the unexpected gift rather than understanding what it actually represented, that is the specific shape of this kind of wrong. It does not require dramatic concealment. It requires only the assumption that no one is going to look. The assumption is that the structure of the information is such that the person who should have the information will not go looking for it because they do not know there is something to look for. My father's administration of that trust was conducted with the confidence of someone who believed that the gap between what he had done and what I knew about it was permanent. Margaret Holt's face at that birthday party was the crack in that confidence. And once a crack exists, the structure does not hold. If there is trust in your family. If you have been told one exists or if you have reason to believe one might exist, ask. Ask the estate attorney. Ask the trustee. Ask the questions that feel too formal or too suspicious or too much like distrust to ask, because the alternative to asking is that the answer exists and you simply do not have it. And the answer may be the kind that changes how you understand the last several years of your own life. I am working with my therapist, with my attorney, and with the uncomfortable patience that complicated situations require, to hold all of this at once. The love for my father and the clear-eyed accounting of what he did. The relief that I finally know and the grief that I did not know sooner. The $47,000 I received and the $300,000 to $400,000 I should have received and the graduate school I did not attend and the opportunities that were available in a version of my life that my father's choices foreclosed without my knowledge. I am holding all of it. Some days I hold it better than others. But I am holding it, and I am keeping the ledger, and the ledger does not lie even when the people responsible for it have decided, for a period of years, that lying was the more manageable option. The ledger always finds a way to be read. That is today's story on the Family Ledger. Leave a comment wherever you are watching from. Tell me what time it is and whether there is a question in your family you have been avoiding asking because the answer might change something. I read every single one. Subscribe for the next story every week. Check the description for another one I think you will connect with. Thank you for being here. Really. It means more than I can say.